You can probably see the first slide of the presentation. I'd normally put up one like this, which has got some nice pictures on it. You'll find pictures all the way through, some of which are relevant, some of which are just nice to look at, basically. But I've put up 6 very prominent, what I would call early modern princes. The word prince was generally used in the 16th and 17th century to mean monarch. So that's why I've called them princes, because you've got actually 6 kings and an emperor here, really, technically. But as you can see, I put them in sort of loosely chronological order, but the top left is Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. Then next to him in black armor is his son, Philip II. Oh, yeah, you got it? It's his son, Philip II. Then you can see Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden, who was a prominent Swedish military leader in the early 17th century, actually killed at the Battle of Lutzen in 1632. Then we've got Louis XIV, actually known for his longevity. He reigned almost from the day he was born, because his father died quite early, 1638 until 1715. But until around about 1661, he was really not an active king. He had a regency. Then at the bottom left-hand side, you've got Frederick the Great. This is a contemporary picture. There's loads and loads of 19th century versions of him, but this is actually an authentic. And then I threw in George III because I thought we should have an English king. All right. So I think we're probably just about ready to start. Just a couple of prefaces. First of all, this is quite a long presentation. There are 21 slides. The reason I've had it sent out as a PDF is so that if you miss stuff, you can read the slides. I try to write these things so they're meaningful for those people who don't attend. So if you get it, at least it's got some sense to it. It is also quite a complicated period, so I've tried my best to make it coherent. So if I move on to the second slide. All right, so there are 4 things I want to do. I want to introduce you to the political history of the early modern Europe and try to make it coherent. To give you a framework, if you like, to understand its politics. In other words, not just a narrative story, but why it was like it was. And obviously to consider some important themes of the period. And to give you some sense of some of the important narratives, in other words, the kind of stories. I'm going to start with that first. Just briefly, I don't know how many of you are Open University students and how many of you are intending to do A223, which is the 2nd level history, early modern course, which is about the social and economic history of this period. I've always thought that it's useful to have a kind of political introduction, partly because I'm old fashioned and that was the way I was trained. And it's great that study of this period has widened out as much as it has over the past 50 years, but I still think it's quite good to have this basic kind of foundation. So that's really what my intention is here, right? Right. This is a map of Europe in about 1500. Don't worry too much about the details. If you've got the PDF, you'll be able to look at it in detail sort of later. Just note how incoherent it looks. I mean, if you looked at a map of Europe today, we've got a nice little set of blocks with all these countries labelled. So, you know, you've got Germany and Italy, etc. This is what Europe looked like in the early modern period, an absolute shambles and confusion. All right. You might notice the kind of confusion around Germany, which I will come to a little bit later. But essentially, Europe in the early part of the 16th century was was a kind of composite mix of overlapping kind of jurisdictions. I will explain that in more detail shortly. All right. But to start with, here's a story. All right. What I've done is I've listed the key narrative events of the period, roughly speaking, from about 1500 to the late 18th century. All right. And I've tried to list these in roughly chronological, which began initially over a rivalry for Italy, but basically developed developed in the next 2 centuries. The key problem really was France's fear of being encircled by what you might call Habsburg possessions. For a lot of this period, Habsburg monarchs ruled Spain and also ruled Germany and also clung on to the Netherlands. And when you look at a map, obviously you can see this surrounding France. Generally speaking, in this period, France grew stronger, but there were interruptions. So that's the first thing, a rivalry, if you like, between France and Spain and the Habsburgs. The next thing down is the threat of the expansion of the Ottoman Empire, which is roughly speaking centered on Turkey, but also took in large parts of North Africa as well, and spread into the Balkans in this period. This was a threat to the whole of Christian Europe, but particularly to the Habsburgs and also to the Venetian Republic, which was probably the strongest Italian state at the time. I'll have a map of that further down the line. But it's worth noting, you know, you look at a map of Europe, in 1485, in 1529, and in 1683, the Turks were able to besiege Vienna. That's as far as they got, and they were defeated on all 3 occasions. But that's quite a long way into Central Europe. You're approaching Germany, all right? Right, the next thing is I'm going to discuss the Holy Roman Empire a bit later, but also importantly is the conflict within the Holy Roman Empire, which was essentially Germany, but also part of the Netherlands and obviously Austria. But there were constant stresses between the emperor himself and the next tier down, which are a whole sequence of princes who owned bits of Germany, if you like. Okay, then you've got the French wars of religion. Throughout most of the period, France was a growing power, as I've said, and it was powerful in the early part of the 16th century, but it went into a bit of eclipse in the second part of the 16th century. It was torn apart a bit by religious conflict, which again, I'll come on to a bit later, but also there were problems again between the king and the aristocracy beneath him. And in fact, there was a bit of a tripartite struggle between a Protestant prince, Henry of Navarre, a Catholic Duke of Guise, and Henry III, the actual king himself. Interestingly, all 3 of them wound up being assassinated. Henry III had the Duke of Guise assassinated, and then a Guise supporter took revenge the following year. And then Henry IV, who was Henry of Navarre, was assassinated in 1610 by a fanatical Catholic. He was actually a fanatical Protestant. I apologise. He was a Protestant who became a Catholic. Then you've got the revolt of the Netherlands. Weirdly, the Netherlands, being both Holland and Belgium, belonged to the Spanish for complex reasons and tried to break away, and the Spanish fought them over that. It lasted for 80 years, although there was a little bit of a truce in the middle, as you can see. Okay, and then part 2, this is kind of into the middle of the 17th century. Some historians have talked of something called a general crisis of the 17th century. Included in that would be the British Civil Wars, something called a fronde in France, which I think means the kind of emblems that the peasants carried, which are kind of, you know, leaves and plants, etc. But also the 30 Years' War in Germany, which was from 1618 to 1648. So there is the discussion about whether there was a general crisis. Towards the end of the 17th century and into the 18th century, you've got the rise of both Britain and France. Britain, until really the 1650s under Cromwell, had been a relatively small power, though it could exercise some power on the periphery of Europe. After the interregnum, when Cromwell took over and before Charles II came along, Britain was rising. It became much more important, and its main rival was France. I mean, in a way, from a French perspective, Britain took over from Spain. And throughout the 18th century, Britain fought the French. I mean, and that merged into the American War of Independence, when the French supported the American colonists in breaking away from us, and then the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. A bit out of sequence, you've also got the development of colonization. I mean, in this period, starting again before the turn of the 16th century, Spain and Portugal were beginning colonize parts of the Americas. Portugal in particular was creating ports in Asia as well, in Africa, in India, and so on. Later, they were followed by the British, the French, the Dutch, and believe it or not, the Danish as well. And especially into the latter part of the 17th and into the 18th century, you have these powers rivaling each other. And those conflicts fed into conflicts in Europe. So a lot of the conflict between Britain and France was about the colonies, although the British also feared French domination of the continent. And then a bit outside of this, there is conflict in the Baltic as well, around the decline initially of Denmark, which was fairly powerful at the beginning of the 16th century, with the rise and decline of Sweden, which became a major military power. Gustavus Adolphus was one of the key founders of that, remember him from the picture. And then also the rise of Russia, which eventually eclipsed Sweden. And then finally, you've also got the rise of Brandenburg Prussia as well. Okay, so that's the narrative. As I say, have a look at the PDF afterwards, and you can follow the actual details of these conflicts. Some of them I'll talk about, but I can't. It's very difficult for me to be totally comprehensive. I'm hoping you're all okay. I can gabble, I know, so I'm going quite fast. But if everybody's okay, next slide. I want to make some general points about the early modern period to start with, to give you a kind of general context about what it was really like. The first thing to say is, outside of a few places, primarily, I suppose, the Netherlands, and oddly, some parts of Germany, these were what you might call subsistence economies. This meant people could produce just about enough to live. There was very little in the way of luxuries for very many people. They're mainly rural societies with a limited urban element, although that was growing. They produced a small surplus, essentially, for an administrative elite and a small manufacturing sector. I put a couple of pictures in of kind of rural life. They probably show these peasants being more prosperous than they actually were, to be honest with you. But most of the kind of glorious pictures I'm going to show you, that luxury and decorative stuff really came about because the rest of the population was in poverty, in a sense. Communications were poor. Thus, Europe was much bigger then than it is now. You couldn't travel, it took you ages to travel. As an example, probably at the beginning of the 18th century, it took 3 weeks to get from London to Edinburgh. So you're talking long distances. Although it's also true to say people travelled rather more than is generally thought. And letters travelled quite a long distance, although they might take a long time to arrive. So these are places where you're just about alive, and your contact with the outside world was fairly limited. I've said rural rather than urban, although urban areas were growing, probably of the population between about 5 to about 10–15% during the period. There was no belief in progress. I mean, the Enlightenment of the 18th century, which is a major intellectual movement, changed this a bit. But generally speaking, people did not expect things to get any better. If anything, the further they got from the Garden of Eden, the worse they think things were. So it's quite a pessimistic societies in many ways. Right, also very hierarchical. The general belief was that God put you in life where he wanted you to be, and you should know your place. So a prince was put at the top of the society because that's what God wanted. And you as a peasant were put at the bottom because that's where he wanted you to be. And the idea was that you should do your role as well as you could to please God, but do not aspire to anything more. Also during this period, population was growing. People didn't really necessarily understand this, but they did feel the consequences. And you'll see a bit later on that there were attempts to deal with population growth. that this created obviously pressures on food supplies in subsistence economies without a kind of, without modern technology and the ability to grow stacks of food. People were just about, virtually the only way you could grow more food is if you brought more land under cultivation, which is what happened. It was also made worse by a mini ice age, which is like the reverse of what we're facing. The early part of the 17th century was quite cold, and you can see in the skating picture above, I mean, the Thames and the Seine both froze over at different times. It was called, Henry Carman, who I don't know if he's retired now, but was a professor of history at Warwick University, called his first textbook The Iron Century to kind of cover that sense of it. He's also referred to warfare, there's a lot of it. As I've said, almost continuous warfare in the period. So it virtually hardly any year of the early modern period didn't have a war going on somewhere, although not, of course, everywhere. And finally, I wanted to say, people did feel like us. I'll give you some examples in a minute, but thought differently. So, it's quite difficult to develop an understanding of the way they thought because they did think so very differently from the way we think, but they still felt the same set of emotions. And I've given a couple of examples here, just to bring people a little bit closer, just to bring them a bit closer. This is from J.J. Scarabry's brilliant biography of Henry VIII. It's quite old now, but I still think it's the best. So if you want to read a good, solid biography of Henry VIII from an excellent political historian, read Scarabry. It's still in print, I think. But this is about, if you look on the left, Catherine Howard, who was Henry VIII's fifth wife. And he had her executed in 1543, I think, for committing adultery, which he undoubtedly did. She was 20 and he was in his early 50s, and he married her because you really didn't get much of a choice if he asked to marry you, But anyway, the key thing I wanted you to know, you can read the whole thing, but at the bottom, it took Henry quite a while to work out that she committed adultery, and he didn't believe what was being said to him. So at the end, he's got, because you see in the middle, but still Henry refused to believe. Only when he met Rothsey, one of his advisors, and Norfolk was the Duke of Norfolk, secretly was the truth borne in upon him. First, he raged and threatened Catherine with violence. Then he wept, bemoaning his misfortune in meeting such ill-conditioned wives. Then he turned on the council and tried to blame them, counsel his advisors. Finally, he departed, and for days thereafter solaced himself in hunting. So, he was subject to rages of jealousy. He had feelings. And then I thought, a bit more touchingly, this is Pepys. Samuel Pepys, who was Secretary of State for the Navy under Charles II and kept a famous diary. This is what he wrote about his brother's death. I returned by coach, it being very late and dark, to my brother's, but all being gone, the corpse laid out, and my wife and Mrs. Turner's. I thither, and there after an hour's talk, we went up to bed, my wife and I, in the little blue chamber. And I lay close to my wife, being full of disorder and grief for my brother, but I could not sleep nor wake with satisfaction. At last I slept till 5 to 6 o'clock. It's just an example that people had feelings. There was a theory that because death was so prevalent, if you had a child, the chances were that at least you'd be lucky if 1 in 3 survived. There was this belief that early modern people, protected themselves by having no feelings, and it just isn't the case. There's plenty of evidence that they did suffer these things. So they're not that remote from us. Their ideas are different, but their feelings were the same. Okay. Right. What you've got on the left-hand side is a map of Burgundy. Right. I'm going to look at 4 related themes. First of all, I've already mentioned what you might call overlapping jurisdictions and the composite state. So I'm going to look at the political structure of the state in the early modern period. Then also the rise of something called the impersonal and bureaucratic state and the military fiscal state. All right. So during this period, states changed. Whereas you start with this kind of composite, shambolic, dynastic, inherited complexity, slowly a lot of states did actually consolidate. And that is a process that's ongoing at the end of the early modern period. And it continued. It continued well into the 19th and perhaps even into the 20th century. All right. At the heart of this process, right, was what you might call dynastic disputes and the conflict between the rising power of states and the consequent tensions within the next caste down, the nobility, but also with others in society. I mean, basically, there is a paradox here in the sense that what really happens is that the princes, the kings, the monarchs, the emperors try very hard to consolidate their power, and they do that by controlling the nobility, who are the most dangerous class as far as they're concerned. That attempt to control and centralize their power and become absolute in their control obviously created problems, not just for the nobility, but also for the business classes, merchants, but also sometimes peasants. All right. And then finally, and I'm going to leave this till the end because it's what's up, everybody concentrates on, but in doing so, they miss some important points. And that is, this was complicated, obviously, by religion. All right. So pausing there, it's, I don't know, I want to ask if everybody's all right, if you're still with me. And I don't know if you can all respond, but anyway, there's not, everything seems to be all right anyway. Right, I'm going to take 4 examples of the problems with composite states, overlapping jurisdictions, all right? And I'm going to start with what you might call ducal Burgundy. Now, strictly speaking, this is the 15th century. My justification, going back into the Middle Ages, if you like, is that the problems created by the collapse of ducal Burgundy lasted well into the 16th and even into the 17th century. All right. Essentially, between the latter part of the 14th and the end of the 15th century, Burgundy was ruled by Valois dukes who were very rich and very powerful. And the orange bits you can see above are basically what you might call the ducal lands. The interesting thing about the Dukes of Burgundy is they were incredibly powerful. They ran their own armies and they were very rich because they held the Netherlands, which you can see above, the County of Flanders, Duchy of Brabant, Duchy of Luxembourg. These were probably the richest areas in the whole of Europe, and whoever controlled them, and the Dukes of Burgundy did, was going to be rich. Further down, you can see Burgundy. Strictly speaking, the Dukes of Burgundy were the vassals of the Holy Roman Emperor for the Netherlands, but they were the vassals of the French king for the Burgundy. All right. Looking at the map, you can see the complicated set of titles they had, and they held these places in different ways. I mean, sometimes they completely controlled them, sometimes they had to pander to estates, which were often collections of nobles, kind of parliaments. But you can see that one of the driving factors was to try and consolidate them. Charles the Bold, who was a bit of a medieval thug, and a very capable military captain, tried to unite these two provinces, which were separate. And so therefore, he took from the Duchy of Lorraine, for a little while anyway, the pink bits. You can see the Duchy of Bar and the Duchy of Lorraine. Rather stupidly, he decided it'd be a good idea to have conflicts with the Swiss as well. And so in the end, what actually happened is the Swiss and the Duke of Lorraine united and defeated and actually killed him in 1477 at the Battle of Nancy. You can see it there. He overreached himself, essentially. Directly he did that, the King of France took advantage of the situation and walked in on Burgundy. And really, the result of all this is that the Burgundian state, if you want to call it that, collapsed. You can see that René II, the Duke of Lorraine, actually had provinces of himself. He was Duke of Bar, Duchy of Lorraine, but he also claimed to be King of Naples. So, I mean, the situation was not uncommon. You'd find a situation where you'd be a duke of one thing and a vassal of somebody, but also you'd be a king somewhere else. And so this could be highly complex. And it's this kind of complexity that a lot of monarchs wanted to remove. All right. I'm sorry, I've gone back again. Right. So that's Burgundy. Burgundy, as I said, had gone by the start of the early modern period. Then I thought the second example is the Kingdom of Navarre. What you can see is France in 1477 on the map. If you look at it again, you can see something that's a really quite the same sort of mix as Burgundy. In other words, there's all these duchies, dukedoms, provinces, which all held in a sort of vassalage to the French king. The Duchy of Brittany, which you can probably see of holiday fame, basically was almost independent, hence it's a kind of different colour, green, all right? But I also want you to focus on Navarre, which is right at the bottom, if you can see a lighter green, stretching from the Viscountcy of Bern all the way through to actually northern Spain. The interesting thing about this is that for most of this period, or for the most of the 16th century, sorry, this is a minor place. But it just so happens that the inheritor of part of it, Henry IV, became King of France, so he became incredibly powerful. I mean, I've said in the writing, you can see in the map opposite, which gives a good sense of how fragmented France was in the late 15th century. You know, you can see that, but the map shows a picture of overlapping jurisdictions where strong nobles ruled areas of France almost independently under a French king. It really wasn't until the 17th century that the French Bourbon kings, Henry IV, who had been King Henry III of Navarre, Louis XIII and Louis XIV, eroded noble power to such an extent that they had total control of France. So this disappears sort of during our period. The only other thing I want to point out is that if you remember the previous map of Burgundy, you can see from the map of France where Burgundy was in relationship to France. But look at the red border. Those are the bits that, the bits on the French side of that red line are the bits that Louis XI grabbed after the death of Charles the Bold. That created tensions. It started, as I say, what the French were trying to do is avoid encirclement by the Habsburgs. So the more land they grabbed, obviously, the further the border went towards the Habsburgs, and it created a lot of resentment. I mean, you know, in protecting themselves, they created even more tensions. All right. So that's Navarre. So we've had Burgundy and Navarre. Then the third example is, oh, sorry, there's something else I wanted to add. This is about Navarre. Just another map. I mean, there's quite a lot of information here, but basically you can see Navarre as it is in relationship to Spain. And in 1512, Aragon walked in on the Spanish bits of Navarre, which is the large square block in Spain. The pointy bit going into France was the bit that Henry III of Navarre, later Henry IV of France, was able to hang on to. Okay, so I've said at the bottom, if it interests you, the intimate story of all this, have a look at Norman Davies's Vanished Kingdoms, which covers a very long period. It looks at places that have disappeared from the map of Europe. Burgundy is part of that. Prussia, which I'm going to come to later, is also. It covers a long period from 418 to 1991. So it's quite a long book and it's quite a long period, but a substantial chunk of it takes in our period. All right. Sorry, I forgot I got that slide. Yeah, the other thing is the empire of Charles V. And here you can see it. This is by far the most dominant political entity in the first half of the 16th century. Again, I've used G.R. Elton's Reformation Europe, which is quite an old book, but it's still basically available. I mean, I used it as an undergraduate, but you can get a new edition of it. And I thought I'd use his language rather than my own to describe what actually happened. The interesting thing about the empire of Charles V is he didn't conquer much of it. He inherited it. So if you read from his father, Philip the fair was the Duke of Burgundy, one step on from Charles the Bold, but he only really was ruling the Netherlands bit. When he died in 1506, Charles became titular ruler of Burgundy. As he was only 6, he didn't become its real duke until 1515. Franche-Comté, which is now a part of France, was an independent eastern bit of Burgundy. All right, but he took France. He took basically he was Duke of Burgundy. Although the French king had grabbed that and he kind of lost it, but he kept the name. Franche-Comté, which is the bit of Burgundy that was in the Holy Roman Empire, Luxembourg and the Netherlands, okay? And in 1515 declared of age became its duke. In 1516, his grandfather, Ferdinand of Aragon, bequeathed to him the crown of Aragon with Sicily and Naples. I skipped over that a bit, but Ferdinand and Isabella had married, and that united Castile and Aragon, which you can see on the map, almost uniting the whole of Spain, basically. And he got that when Ferdinand died, basically. Okay. From that, of course, he got the American conquests as well, which you can see on the left-hand side of the map. His mother, Juana, actually lived, I think she lives slightly longer than he did, actually, and she was his nominal ruler. She was the nominal ruler of Spain, but unfortunately she was locked up in a monastery. She undoubtedly did have mental problems, but some of it was engineered. The personal union of Ferdinand and Isabella, Catholic kings, which had created something like a Spanish realm, was thus embodied in one man. And for this, so basically he's now got the whole of Spain and a lot of the Burgundian kingdoms, or including the bulk of the Netherlands. Then his other grandfather, the Emperor Maximilian, also died, and that gave him the Holy Roman Empire, the Austrian lands, Austria, Tyrol, Styria, Carinthia, Cariola, and also, the Holy Roman Empire, which you can see outlined in black. The thing about Charles V is he found this almost ungovernable. When he died, well, he didn't. He actually retired in 1556 and died in 1558, I think. But he divided his kingdom and gave the Spanish bits and the Netherlands to Philip II, his son, in the previous picture, and the Holy Roman Empire bits to his brother Ferdinand, because he felt it was ungovernable. The big problem for him is he had constant problems with the German Protestant princes, and the wealth that poured into Spain could finance his armies, but the Spanish couldn't understand why they should be paying out huge amount in taxes in order to finance his wars with German princes. And that was the big problem with these composite kingdoms. One part of it really didn't like having to finance and support trouble in another that seemed so very far away. And Charles V, I mean, if anything, he was worn out by the end of his life, basically. So that's the global empire of Charles V. And then, I'm sorry, these maps aren't wonderfully clear. Then Prussia. This is long after Charles V. But basically, throughout the 17th and into the 18th century, what had originally been the Duchy of Brandenburg, which you can see in the top left-hand side, gradually grew. During the 30 Years' War, this territory was devastated along with the rest of Germany. And the elector changed sides 3 times. But as a result of the Peace of Westphalia, which ended those wars in 1648, he gained territory. And you can sort of see that in map 2, okay? This kingdom grew mainly militarily. There was a creation of a Prussian standing army in 1653, which some people would say started almost a tradition of militarism in Prussia. And that went on into the 18th century. A series of very, very powerful electors, then they became kings in 1701, created a centralized state. Probably the most famous is, as I've said, is Frederick the Great. So by the end of the 18th century, Prussia was a great power, effectively. Napoleon reduced it, partly because, you know, military victories, but the Prussians learned from him and created an even better bureaucracy. So into the 19th century, Prussia was a very powerful state, and eventually it was Prussia which united Germany. Prussia was seen by the Allies at the end of the Second World War as an incredibly dangerous state, and at the end of the Second World War, there wasn't a peace settlement. I mean, basically, the Americans, the British, and the Russians got together, and they just abolished Prussia. It was just written off the map. But there you are. That's 4 examples of the growing of states out of this composite set of, you know, different states. Right, next. Basically, I won't read all this out because there's quite a lot here, but please do have a look at it. At the top, I've quoted actually from one of my lecturers, one of his books, The Origins of the Modern European State, which is a very important book. But the blurb at the back says, Dr. Shannon examines the transition from the personal princely authority of the 15th century to the emergence by the 18th of the concept of the impersonal state. And it seems that, what the hell does that mean? Well, as I said, it's a kind of contradictory thing that as princes' power increased, and they tried to separate themselves out from the nobility and to present themselves as something more than just superior nobles, as kings are somehow different, and a range of them did this. That process itself created new states, a new structured state, which was somehow separate from their provinces. I mean, for someone like Charles V, his empire was his own personal property. He'd inherited these provinces. You know, it's a bit like somebody inheriting a load of houses. They were his, you know. But basically that changed so that instead of being the owner of a large amount of property, which happened to have a load of subjects living in it, he became somehow an office holder in himself. You know, the king had a job. Probably one of the clearest ways to see this is in 1688, when the English nobility got rid of the Catholic James II. They invited William of Orange, who became William III, and Mary, who was James II's daughter, to come and run the country. And they gave him a job. They wrote out a job description, in a sense. So he wasn't just getting provinces. He was basically becoming a king of a territory which had an independent existence. I've given you a couple of quotes from the first is from the Petition of Compromise. The Netherlands conflict broke out really because Philip II, he tried to get rid of Protestantism in the Netherlands, which was nearly impossible, and he tried to increase taxation. And what you've got is examples of nobles protesting about that. And then his reply. But the key thing, as I say, have a read of this. The key thing to note about it is that the nobility expected to be consulted and listened to, and Philip expected to have his orders obeyed. And it's that created all these tensions, if you like. Right. Again, sorry, it's a very crammed slide, but do sort of have a look at it. One of the ways that the kings did actually try and present their power was by display. And I've given 2 examples here. That's the court of Philip the Bold. Charles the Bold. His father had been Philip. And he dressed his court with immense amount of ceremony and, you know, a clear indication of his status was the height of his throne. It's worth remembering he wasn't a king, he was a duke, but he tried to elevate himself into that status. And this is an illuminated manuscript. He created his own ducal library and was very fond of books. But again, these illustrations indicate an attempt to make himself more than just a duke, if you like. The next one on the right-hand side is the Field of the Cloth of Gold, which was the occasion of a meeting between Francis I and Henry VIII, basically to settle their differences. At this stage, very late in the process, the British still held Calais, and lands around it, and it was discussing their relationship. You can, if you look carefully, you can see Henry VIII on a white horse to the centre left, if you like. But again, display all these magnificent tents and stuff, and dress was all there to show off their power. And if you were a noble, you could not aspire to present yourself, as of a higher status. Louis XIV was quite capable of confiscating aristocratic property if he thought it was too grand. So, it was as well to sort of be careful about that. This is again, having said all that and emphasizing the power of these monarchs, it's very, very important to recognize that they couldn't do just what they liked. This was, as I say, a very conservative period, but it wasn't a period without political controversy. And one of the things that tended to happen was that scholars would look into what were the exact rights of kings, what were the exact rights of princes, and they would, what were the rights of estates. Some people built this. I mean, the classic example is the Italian, he's not really a philosopher, but political writer Machiavelli, who tended to say, this is all rubbish, basically. It's how you exercise power and how you acquire it. And people later on in the 17th century, the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes more or less said the same thing, but they kind of tended to outrage people. The basic justifications tended to come from the Bible and from the classics, particularly Aristotle. It's a bit of a mistake to think that the classics have been somehow forgotten in the Middle Ages and revived in the Renaissance. There was always that interest, basically. But what I took just one little famous example, which is Henry VIII trying to divorce Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, so he could marry Anne Boleyn. It's a story we all know, and we kind of assume Henry VIII got rid of Catherine of Aragon and just married his mistress because she was pregnant. But it wasn't anywhere near as simple as that. The whole process took 2 or 3 years. Henry VIII actually, if I can say this, tended to treat Catherine quite well. He didn't want to punish her in any way or bully her. That side of it was fairly, though she was very angry, that side of it wasn't what he was about. But he couldn't just do it. So here's what, again, Scarisbrick says about his attempts to get a divorce. A galaxy of Greek and Hebrew scholars, Christian and Jew, of theologians and canonists, of religious houses and universities, first in England and then on the continent, were to be called upon to provide evidence for the king. Soon English agents were abroad in France and Italy, especially quizzing and cajoling, ransacking libraries, interrogating university faculties, drawing up lists of signatories in this or that friary, urging canonists and scripture scholars to take up the pen. By the end, they had assembled a weighty corpus from scores of scholars and institutions. Meanwhile, of course, the other side had been no less energetic. By 1529-30, the king's divorce had occasioned an international debate, violent and swift-moving. It was the sort of competition in scriptural exegesis which the printing press made easy. After dipping into that prolific pamphlet war, one can only come away marvelling at the learning of some many of the contestants, at their ease with their fathers, with the remoter councils, with minor scholastics, at their dialectical acumen, at their energy. I mean, the key thing to know, this is just one little example of the arguments about rights and wrongs of things. We all think, oh, Henry could just, throw his old wife and take on a new, but he couldn't. And part of that was, of course, inheritance. I mean, as we all know, Anne Boleyn gave birth to a woman, Elizabeth I, who became one of the greatest, obviously the greatest Tudor monarch, but they didn't know that. And Henry VIII wanted to prove that if he was going to get a son, that son had a right to succeed. You couldn't just do what you liked, in other words, even though, you had a superior position. And of course, Charles I fell foul, and James I fell foul to that in Britain. But this kind of argument about who was right and who was wrong was very powerful. And then I thought I would give you a few descriptions of these the three examples of these monarchs, the ones who are trying to increase their status. But it also indicates, again, their sort of kind of their motivations and what they were like. Now, this is Charles V to start with, again, from Elton's Reformation Europe. The young man who by these rapid stages gathered the fruits of 100 years of policy was a slight, rather ugly man with a reserved manner. His mind was slow, but though unoriginal, far from negligible. In the important sentences, he suffered from a high sense of duty and a powerful conviction of God's demands on him. As he grew older, the force of experience readily assimilated in a retentive memory increased his stature until he appeared as a truly formidable ruler and an outstanding monarch of his day. But he had a very strong sense of duty. And then it says about Philip II, his son, who was far less confident. It says that, Charles V had impressed upon his son his own high sense of duty, as expressed in the famous confidential instructions which he prepared for him. And at the bottom, the final sentence here is, Philip only felt completely safe among his state papers, which he would tirelessly read, mark, and annotate and amend. They believed that they had to rule properly, and they agonized over making the wrong decisions. And as I said, Charles V, as an emperor, had a hugely difficult task trying to cope with everything. And eventually it forced him into a monastery and probably gave him an early death. Louis XIV was probably less like that, but it's still interesting to read this. It was one thing for the king and his apologists to stake a theoretical claim to absolute authority, quite another to translate it into action. What singled Louis XIV out from other monarchs of the early modern period was his determination to be as good as his word. A crucial step was taken immediately after the death of Mazarin, Cardall Mazarin had been his regent, basically, with his mother. Summoning the council, he told Councillor Siquier, "Sir, I have brought you together with my ministers and my secretaries of state to tell you, until now I was willing to permit the late cardinal to conduct my affairs. It is time that I govern them myself." And he did just that. Crucially, he proved to have the necessary qualities of intelligence, application, and sheer charisma to make the personal monarchy work. He dominated the kingdom's Supreme Council, from which he excluded the great and the good, notably the princes of the blood, in whose vein the blood of the Bourbons ran thickly enough to encourage independent political ambitions. You can see from all these how they ruled, what they thought they were doing, and how they were trying to suppress the aristocracy, if you like. Okay. Again, go back and have a read of these. Right. Okay. We're nearing the end, you'll be pleased to know. What developments lay behind the development of the impersonal state? Right. To be honest with you, it's the development of a bureaucratic state. Part of this is increasingly governments had to do more. And this required organisation, which in turn meant the development of bureaucracies. Sometimes these were actually local, like the poor laws, for example, sometimes centrally. And I've said there are three basic parts to this, I think. Bear in mind, this is running alongside the development of absolutism in some countries and the suppression of the aristocracy in some countries. One of the factors was the end of various church organisations, particularly in Protestant areas. So the Reformation, which is the split between Protestants and Catholics, and the removal of the Pope as a figure of authority from sort of, if you like, Northern and Western Europe. That meant the closing of the abbeys and the monasteries. That was taken. Henry VIII, for example, abolished the monasteries and simply took their wealth. But they dealt with poverty, and doing this meant that instead of that created a vacuum. And so instead of dealing with poverty and wealth, the state had to take out over dealing with poverty and wealth. Sorry, I'm sounding a bit incoherent. It was made worse by what I mentioned earlier, which is population growth, which was a result of a recovery basically from the Black Death, which we think had killed a third of the population. Well, as that population is replaced, it puts pressure on food, and it gets more poverty. People notice that. They don't know why, but they realize they had to deal with more poor people. And they created discipline structures because they tended to blame the poor for their poverty rather than recognizing the wider problem. So, to be honest with you, social organizations were created, poorhouses, hospitals, places like that. Okay. Hospital, by the way, just meant institution in the 17th century. So that's one thing. The other thing was the growing expense of warfare. The armies that the French and the Spanish were plundering around Italy with in the latter part of the 15th into the 16th century, 20,000 apiece, possibly 25 maybe. By the 30 Years' War, you're talking about 40,000 with a backup team as well. By the 17th century, you're talking about armies which were approaching 100, 200,000. Napoleon took 600,000 men into Russia in 1812. Now, that is incredibly demanding. It's also professional in the sense that the weapons being used, no longer billhooks and the odd sword and knife. You've now got sophisticated cannons, and technology, basically, and people who have to know how to use them. And people who have to know how to wield large numbers of men on battlefields. So basically, you're creating a whole structure which requires training, which is bureaucratic, which has people, army staffs behind who are not actually fighting. And this creates something which is commonly known as the military fiscal state. In other words, a state demanding more in taxation, and that requires management and bureaucracy. And then finally, the overall process of the development of colonies, particularly of commerce and trading, creates some private and some public bureaucracies. Key ones like management of colonies, you have to have a colonial office, banking, insurance, shipping, commercial companies. And, the consequence of that is state bureaucracies which manage these and police them, if you like, okay? And this all meant that it was increasingly difficult for the Crown to manage. And this means decisions inevitably get shipped out and delegated to bureaucracies and officials who are managed by rules and regulations. So the Crown becomes, if you like, more remote. This is Europe in 1750. I'll skip that. You can see it beginning to get more consolidated if you compare it with that map which I gave you first off. I've missed something, sorry. There's a page missing. Sorry, religion. I skipped, sorry, I apologize, I skipped over this slide, but we're coming near to the end now. You can't really not deal with religion in early modern Europe. It's almost impossible to overestimate its importance. And the importance of the impact of the Reformation, which is, as I say, is the divisions in the churches. But it's important to get it into perspective. It wasn't always the most important factor, especially for some, while for others it was all important. I could take somebody like Cardinal Richelieu, who was for about 20, 25 years, Louis XIII of France in the early part of the 17th century, his key minister, an immensely powerful man and a churchman. He rose up from the minor aristocracy through to an incredibly powerful position via the church, just by becoming a cardinal. Yet, oddly enough, directly he died, he became of no importance whatsoever. He hadn't a clientage network like, say, the Guises to leave behind and somebody to inherit it. He just went. But the important thing about him is he's probably the least religious person in the whole period. I mean, it's Richelieu, who, next paragraph down, who's responsible for allying Catholic France with Protestant Sweden. I don't mean that he didn't believe in God. It's just that it was of secondary importance to him, basically. And other things, affairs of state, were more important. And his duty was to protect France and protect the domains of Louis XIII. So he would do everything. If the Swedes were basically fighting the Habsburgs, then he would finance and support the Swedes. It's a bit like Churchill. I think actually what Churchill said was that if Hitler invaded hell, I would at least make a passing favourable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. And in a sense, that's kind of an extreme version of what Richelieu would have thought. But this was not uncommon. The English and the French at different times both sought to unite with the Muslim Ottomans against the Habsburg. As I say, France allied with Swedes. The French also supported the Dutch rebels, who were predominantly Protestant, though not totally, against Catholic Spain. So what was the political impact of the Reformation? I don't want to tell you what the Reformation was because it's too complicated, but essentially it was a major protest against the authority of the Pope and the belief that the Catholic Church had imposed laws which had no biblical justification, because this is a period when the Bible was being carefully read in the Greek original by people like Erasmus, and the recognition that church law was often invented by popes because it was convenient. But so the Pope was effectively removed in many places. Many princes liked this because they found the Pope an annoyance. And there were several reasons for this. First of all, the Pope could claim religious authority across the whole of Europe, which interfered with their power, but also the church collected taxes. So, alongside all this having to collect lots of taxes to maintain armies, you didn't want the church taking money, which you needed. So there was a kind of competition to collect taxes, particularly amongst between the nobility, the princes and the church. And this led to rebellions. I mean, probably the most famous is the 1525 revolt of the German peasantry. But, that getting rid of the power of the Pope, what that did, of course, is throw the management of the church into the hands of secular princes. You know that Henry VIII seized control of the church and became head of the Anglican Church in England. But lower down, the removal of the special status of the priests increased both the power of the laity and their ability to interpret and understand the Bible. So it empowered people lower down the system. It made the congregation powerful because the laity could read the Bible. So the priests were no longer special and the congregation chose their own ministers. Very often, certainly in early Protestantism, the Protestant church became prey to a series of incredibly charismatic, often not particularly pleasant sort of Protestant priests. Famous ones, John Calvin, of course, who could give a lecture on his own, and John Knox in Scotland. But it could also be seen in radical sects. There was, Anabaptists in Germany. These are grassroots groups, and those thrown up during the British Civil Wars, who were beginning to demand to create godly communities where they could all live in peace and harmony, which didn't often happen. But also the big problem was, what if you were a Catholic in a Protestant country? What if you owed loyalty to the Pope when the Prince had denounced the Pope, and the other way round? What if you were a Protestant in a Catholic country, where you're expected to obey the King and the Pope? And this was a meaningful thing. I mean, basically, following a religion you didn't believe, if you thought it was rubbish, would endanger your immortal soul. And what this leaked into was the belief that there were some contexts in which you had a right to rebel, as well as, in order to sort all this out, because it created so much wars and bloodsheds, the belief that religion was frankly a private matter. Charles II, when he returned in 1660, said, "I will not make mirrors into men's souls," meaning, frankly, I'm not going to get involved in religious conflict, which actually didn't happen to be true, but I'll give you that's another story. There was also the issue of the dispossessed property of the church, especially land. What was going to happen to this? Well, in Britain, it was fairly simple. The crown grabbed it and then sold it off to a bunch of gentry and nobility. But in Germany, it was a right old mess, because it didn't automatically go to the emperor, who remained a Catholic. It went to the local Protestant princes, and sometimes they fought amongst themselves about it. This particular dispute created all sorts of tensions, which was one of the causes of the 30 Years' War. Okay, and I think, yeah, I was going to show you Europe in 1750 to show you how it consolidated. And then finally, I thought it'd be nice if I just gave you the pictures of a few important books. They all give you the name of the writer. You can get these off the internet quite easily. The two at the bottom, Mark Greenglass and Tim Blanning, I suppose I would strongly recommend them. They're the very recent Penguin History of Europe, and those are the two books that cover out this period. And you could, they're not expensive, so if you wanted a bit of in-depth reading, you could read those. The European World at the top, Biak Kumin, is basically the A223 textbook. And then there's also a reference in the course to Wiesner-Hank's book, but you can also get Ewan Cameron. I put in Reformation because it is so central, which again is a Penguin book. But if you're looking immediately for some books to look at, they're not so little, they're often quite thick. These are them. So that's it. I'll finish now.